Coming up, I do the SKX shake. I launch a spring. Twice. And I get to play with a hammer. Welcome back to another installment of the Bearded Watchmaker. Today's victim is the iconic Seiko SKX. This one being the 009 variant with a nice Pepsi bezel. And I'm sure this watch needs no introduction to anyone with even a passing interest in divers watches. As you can see, this specific one is actually in pretty reasonable condition. Yeah, it has some signs of wear on the bezel and case, but otherwise it's pretty decent. It's not running at the moment, but if you do the SKX shake, it does run for a little while then stop. I've loosened the case back off camera. As you can imagine with a diving watch, the back doesn't come off willingly, so I had to grab my jackset tool to loosen it up first. That rotor isn't feeling very smooth at all, to be honest, but with my faffing around it seems that was enough to give the mainspring a bit of a wind and to get the balance going. Let's see where we're at with the watch by getting some wind onto the mainspring. Then we're off to the time graph to get an idea of where we're at. Okay, well at least there's straight lines, and I'm using the plural because there should only be one horizontal line. But it's certainly not the worst I've seen. If it wasn't for the fact that the power reserve was so low, I'd just regulate the watch and call it a day. The major issue so far is the rate at which the watch gains time per day. Right, so let's have a look here and... Wait a minute, that rotor's loose. Okay, well there's your problem. Let's snip that up quick. I think that can certainly be the reason for our low power reserve. Well, seeing as we're already in here, I think this watch can certainly do with a service. The time graph results were less than stellar, so there is that. I've unscrewed that crown and got the winding stem out. I want to gently get the movement loose from the case and then flip the watch over so the movement can drop out. I did so gently, right? Most modern mainstream watches use a plastic spacer that has a slight friction fit in the case. This is held in place between the front chapter ring and the case back. With the movement out of the case, it's time for the winding stem to go back in so that we can line up the hands for easier removal. Sometimes the movement has ceased from rust when water finds its way into the watch, which makes removing the hands a little more painful. Lucky for us, these hands move just fine. In general, the safest way to get the hands off is by placing a plastic bag over the movement prior to prying off the hands. This protects the dial, which is the main focus of the watch and is incredibly delicate. So as not to lose the hands, yes, it happens, I place them in these handy little plastic cases that has a membrane on each side, keeping the hands sandwiched between them. We can now gently pry the dial off the movement. In the case of most modern Seikos, the dial has two pins on the back that are friction fit into the plastic spacer. With the dial loosened up, it can go into its own little protective case as well. Next up, we can remove the day wheel. But that circlip seems like it's the wrong way around. Those two little chamfers are supposed to be facing down, so you can get a tool in there to pry it off. I'm also seeing tool marks around it, so I'm clearly not the first person to be in this watch. It's not unusual to see tool marks on older watches, but it is suspicious to see it on a modern affordable watch. People don't generally have these watches serviced anymore as it's pretty expensive to do and can sometimes cost as much as what the watch was worth when new. Next up is the date card dial, and that first screw is an incredibly small Phillips screw, which of course needs a special screwdriver to remove it. I'll remove the intermediary wheel for the day corrector, as it sits loose inside there and has a way of disappearing on you. With that out of the way, I can remove the rest of the screws. Getting back to why I think the SKX series were iconic watches, was that when Seiko made these from around 96 till 2018, they weren't only affordable, but also excellent tool watches that was ISO certified for actual scuba diving up to 200 meters. The dials weren't busy, and the lume used on these was some of the best in the industry. We're talking mid $200 here for a beta dive watch with a screw down crown, where even desk divers wanted one to wear as a daily. The only real complaint I share with many others is that there was never any manual winding ability with it. It's strictly an automatic watch, and from there the term SKX shake was born, as this was the only way to wind up the watch. Anyway, more special tools. That's a Presto tool that's used to take the cannon pinion off. We're about done with this side of the watch. Before I flip it over, I'll just get that plastic spacer ring off. It's a little fiddly, but it pretty much just clips off eventually. With the movement flipped over, let's get that rotor off. Because we wound up the mainspring earlier on, it's pretty important to remove the power from it before we carry on. Ask me how I know. In order to do this, we need to remove the second Waterworks reduction wheel. You see the 3 lines on the screw head? This indicates that it's a reverse thread screw, so you have to be careful not to break it. Traditionally, this wheel would be the crown wheel, and for the most part they all use reverse thread screws. And in this case, it's no different. Finally, we can now remove the power from the mainspring. You want to be careful here and gradually bleed off the power, else the rest of the train would be spinning way faster than it was ever designed to do. If you haven't realized it yet, watches are pretty delicate. And with that done, we can remove the balance wheel and bridge. This is probably the most delicate part of a movement, and we want to get this off as soon as we can, to prevent it getting damaged while we're all being clumsy taking things apart. Oh dear. This is pretty bad. You see where all the plating has worn away from the bridge? I suspect that was all because of that loose rotor, creating more wear and play down the Waterworks train down the line. Okay, well let's dig a little deeper and see what other surprises lay ahead of us. I'll need to get that bridge off, and for the less amateur watchmakers out there, you'll see where I forgot to remove something first. Hey, I'm still agonizing over all of that wear, man. Gotta get that ratchet wheel off first before we can remove the bridge, idiot. The 7S26 movement used on these SKX watches were introduced in 1996 and was pretty much the workhorse used in most of Seiko's affordable line of watches. It features a 40-hour power reserve and operates at 21,600 beats per hour, which means 6 ticks per second. This gives a much smoother sweep than what you'd get with a typical quartz movement. Interestingly, it's rated to operate from -10 to 60 degrees Celsius and uses Seiko's Dioshock mechanism, making it resistant to even severe shocks. Yes, it's a cheap movement, but it's also robust, making it ideal as a workhorse in watches like the SKX. As I said before, the biggest drawback of this movement was the lack of hand winding. We're about done taking the movement apart, but man, I'm being real clumsy today. We can now take apart the last of the Waterworks on the main bridge. Flipping the bridge upside down, you can see the little circlip holding the first reduction wheel in place. This one just loves spinning off into nothingness, so you gotta be careful here. And just like that, the reduction wheel drops out and the poor lever can be separated. Seeing as we had so much wear on the movement, I just want to check if there's excessive wear between the poor lever and the reduction wheel, as this is a high friction point and most prone to wear. Amazingly, this all looks good actually. Another wear point is the second reduction wheel, where the poor lever interfaces with it, and amazingly, it also looks okay. That line you see there along the teeth is just old lubricant. Up next, we're taking apart the mainspring barrel. These are a little harder to get apart than traditional barrels, because Seiko never intended for these to be serviced. Typically, you would support the barrel arbor and press down on the barrel for the barrel cap to pop off. In this case, it would likely result in the whole mainspring popping out at the same time, and doing so violently. Seiko generally only sells the barrel complete with mainspring, and truth be told, you should actually just replace it when servicing the movement. For those curious types, I'm showing the barbaric way of separating the cap from the barrel, using a knife to split them apart. Those of you playing at home, take note that sharp blades close to bare fingers carries obvious risk. And there, I still have my fingers. Let's get that arbor out. Then you want to gently start walking the mainspring out of the barrel as I'm showing here. Right, With everything taken apart, it's time to start cleaning all the parts. What we want to do is mount the balance assembly back onto the main plate. This helps protect the balance from possible damage when going through the cleaning process. As I said before, this is easily the most delicate part on the whole watch. I also pre-clean many of the dirtiest, grimiest parts before going through the washing process. This helps to make sure that parts are perfectly clean when done. I use an ultrasonic cleaner to wash my parts. I pack all the parts into these handy little baskets to keep the small parts together, which in turn goes into bigger jars that contain the actual cleaning fluid. These are then placed into the ultrasonic machine filled with water. It's tedious, but I hardly repair enough watches as a hobby to justify getting a fully blown watch cleaning machine. My cleaning process is an ammoniated cleaner. Distilled water rinse, then IPA is the last step to remove any water. Because of the IPA, it's better to wash the pellet fork separately. The end stones of a pellet fork are secured into the fork using shellac, which doesn't play nice with IPA. Some types of shellac doesn't get affected by it, but some types do, and I've had one case where the end stone fell out of the fork because the shellac softened up enough. So I'd rather not risk it and wash the pellet in one dip. After what looks like a few seconds, the parts are nice and clean and ready for assembly to begin. Next step, we're putting the mainspring barrel together. Because this is an automatic movement, I'll be adding some braking grease to the inner wall of the barrel. This will help the mainspring slip inside the barrel when fully wound to protect it when the rotor keeps trying to wind the mainspring. I'll then add a very thin layer of grease to the actual mainspring in order to protect it from corrosion. I'm using a mainspring winder to prepare the mainspring for insertion into the barrel. These can be finicky, and even though I've done a few of them, I still frequently fail spectacularly. After the second failure, I ended up using another mainspring just to be safe. And there we go. A quick push of the lever and the spring is set. The last job on the mainspring would be to fit the top cover, and, wait for it, then we can weld the arbor. As you'll remember earlier, I was concerned about the wear on the main bridge and plate, so I want to check the play between these and the mainspring barrel. I'll fit the main barrel to the plate, and then fit the main bridge. Ouch! Look at all the wear and the play between the top of the main barrel arbor and the main bridge. You can see where the bottom of the ratchet wheel rubbed against the main bridge due to the play of the mainspring barrel arbor. This is obviously not good, as the wear steals power away from the mainspring, affecting the power reserve of the watch. Here you can see how the ratchet wheel actually touches the main bridge due to the amount of play. How do we fix it? Well, with this, my new staking set. I've been itching to use this toy in anger. I'll be using it to close up the hole where the barrel arbor fits and getting rid of that play. The set comes with many stakes of all different shapes and sizes, and that'll allow us to pick the perfect one for the size of the hole we are working with. You kinda need some time setting it up in the set just perfectly. And yes, I get to use a hammer as well. We fit the main bridge back to the main plate and check the play now. The idea is to close up the hole a little more than you need with the staking set so that we can go to the next step, which is these smoothing broaches. This not only allows us to get the hole on the main bridge to the correct size, but also makes that hole perfectly round. It's a bit of a tedious process. You have to broach, fit, but by taking your time you can get the fit perfect. Success! Looks like we managed to get it looking pretty good and the ratchet is no longer rubbing against the main plate. I'm pretty proud of myself. This hobby sure helps expanding your skill set. With all the parts prepped, we can start with the fun part of putting it all together. One very annoying thing about modern Seiko movements are the die shock cap jewels used on the main bridge for the train wheels. These need to be removed and cleaned before the main bridge can be fitted, because once the Waterworks train goes back, you won't have access to these jewels anymore. As you can see, there's 2 of them. In order not to bore you to tears, I'll be showing the process for cleaning only one of them. These are very fiddly to work with, as you can imagine. Don't be fooled at how easy it may look. Through the wonders of video editing, I can cut out all the swearing, crying and failed attempts at fitting these. In particular, fitting the shock cover can be a test in patience. In watchmaking, patience is a skill you have no choice but to learn. The basic idea is to lay the shock cover over the jewel. The trick is then to apply enough pressure on the shock jewel to have it bend over the jewel very slightly while applying pressure. Turn the shock cover to fit into the recess on both sides. This will secure the jewel in position, but in practice that shock cover has a tendency to fly away from you. With the train wheel jewels fitted again, we can apply a little HP 1300 oil to the first Waterworks reduction wheel, where it meets the pull lever. We can then fit the pull lever onto the reduction wheel and add some more HP 1300 to its shaft. I'm clearly a little hungry at this point, as I developed a sudden case of the shakes. Now the first reduction wheel can be fitted to the top plate, and the little circlip can be clipped onto the shaft to keep it into place. With all that done, we can now oil the train wheel jewels with some 9010 oil. For this, the best way is to use an auto oiler to inject the correct amount of oil into the jewel. You can do it manually prior to fitting the cap jewels in the previous step, but as it is, fitting the dia shocks are already fiddly enough. You don't want to ruin the oil placement on the cap jewel while trying to get the shock covers fitted. Onto the main plate, we pretty much put the movement together in the same sequence we took it apart. First up is the keyless works components. These are very high friction parts, so we want to use a DX grease where there's metal to metal contact. This is not part of the movement works, so using a thicker grease won't affect performance. We also apply this grease to the winding stem, and then we can insert it into the main plate while adding the clutch components one by one. A little more grease to the outside of the clutch, then some HP 1300 to the 2 posts where the yoke will be fitted. A little grease where the setting lever meets the yoke, and then the setting lever can be installed. Prior to fitting the setting lever spring, we want to add a little grease where it meets the setting lever. We can clip the lever spring into place, add a little grease where it meets the lever and tighten it down. Finally, we give it a little test to make sure all is good. With the keyless works done, we can move on to the movement works. First item to go in is the center wheel. I'll use a little HP 1300 oil on the pivot jewel, insert the center wheel, install and tighten down the center wheel bridge, and finally add some HP 1300 to the bridge pivot wheel as well. After cleaning up some excess oil using Rodico, I can fit the mainspring barrel and check that it meshes well with the center wheel. In goes the click lever and then the escape wheel. You really want to take time with fitting these and any of the other wheels. The more time you spend making sure these sit properly, the easier it'll be to fit the top bridge later on. With the third wheel fitted, you want to oil the shaft of the fourth wheel with HP 1300 before installing it as well. And now comes the fun part, installing the top plate. Again, these can test your patience, as there's many moving parts that needs to line up before the plate can sit correctly. Sometimes you're lucky and it goes to plan on the first try, or you're not and you end up knocking all the previous hard work out of alignment and you have to start again. Today I was lucky. It doesn't happen often. Before I tighten it all down, I use a plastic tool to hold the plate down and move the main barrel just to check that the whole train moves freely before tightening the plate down. Again, you want to take time to ensure this is done correctly, because if it's not, there's a real risk of breaking pivots and jewels on the train when you force things. Next up is the ratchet wheel, making sure that the flange part of the inside hole lines up with the flat part of the barrel arbor. We're almost done with the motion works, so let's install the pellet fork. This is another part that needs to be very carefully placed just right, so that the pellet fork bridge can be fitted. I wasn't lucky here, so I edited out all the finagling to save you the frustration of peering through it. If you're wondering, we don't oil the jewels for the pellet fork at all, as there is very little side-to-side movement of the fork. Eventually I get it all to sit right so I can tighten it all down. I should have used slightly shorter screws here. I paid for that later when I tried to fit the date wheel on the other side. We can now test the motion works by adding power to the main spring. We want to check that the pellet fork ticks smartly by just nudging it side to side. Let's add a little HP 1300 oil to this post, and then we can fit the second reduction wheel for the Waterworks. This forms part of what Seiko calls the magic hands, and is a simple yet elegant mechanism for the Waterworks system. You'll see the pull levers that interfaces with it, allowing the movement of the rotor in either direction to add power to the mainspring. We add some HP 1300 all around the second reduction wheel, and then we are done with this side of the movement for now. Before flipping the movement over, we want to clip on the plastic spacer. Now that the movement is flipped over, we can oil the bottom of the train jewels using 90-10 oil. Very little is needed, especially on the train wheels. Using too much oil risks the oil running down the pivots and flying all over the movement, possibly interfering enough to affect performance. With that done, we can click in the cannon pinion. After that, we can oil up the cannon pinion and the post for the minute wheel. There's been a lot of debate on Seiko's use of plastic parts in certain areas of the movement. While many feel it's to save costs, I must admit I don't think that's the reason. If you look closely, plastic parts are only used on the calendar works, and I suspect it's because these parts move very slowly and it allows for minimum friction of its operation. The fact that they don't need to be oiled does save a little assembly time, but I personally think it's one of the ways Seiko conserves power use in the calendar works, allowing them to use smaller mainsprings and still get the 40-hour power reserves in the movement. Next up is the date jumper plate and date dial. The little lever on the date jumper needs to be carefully aligned with the inside teeth of the date dial. Once this is done, the date dial guard can be fitted and secured down with a 3 flathead and 1 tiny star screw. It was at this point I realized my earlier mistake of using 2 long screws for the pellet breech, as this was interfering with the fitment of the calendar works. I ended up having to redo the assembly of the calendar works after I fitted the correct screws on the pellet breech. One lesson I keep learning over and over is that if something doesn't sit right, you screwed up. After all that agony, the day wheel can go in. It's a little hard to see, but there's a lever under the dial guard that needs to hook into the teeth under the day wheel. You'll see it click into place and the day wheel will be aligned with the date wheel. Finally, the little circlip can be fitted, this time making sure it's fitted the correct way up. Now comes the moment of truth where we see if we've either done something real stupid or we didn't. We're back to the balance wheel, and this is another one of those fiddly operations where everything needs to line up perfectly for it to work. As always, you have to be incredibly careful, as bending the spring will ruin your day. As I test it, I see the balance wheel doesn't swing like it's supposed to. In this case, it's overbanked. I've edited out all the faffing again, but once I get it installed properly, it fires right up. The last job to do on the movement is to clean and lubricate both die shock jewels on the balance. The process is the same for both, so I'll show you the top one. It's a similar process to how I've done it on the top plate, but in this case I won't use an auto oiler to lubricate them. I'll show you the manual way. In a sense, I kind of prefer doing it manually, as it's easier to make sure you have the exact amount of oil on the end jewel. We put both the end jewel and the setting in a 1-dip solution to clean all the old oil off. Sometimes it's not perfectly clean, so I use some Rodico as a last step. I put a very small amount of 90-10 oil on the end cap, enough to cover around 30% of the surface. I carefully place the setting back onto the end cap, being careful not to smear the oil I've just put on. As you can imagine, this takes a little practice. As before, the trick is to place the spring into the jewel while applying enough force for it to bend enough to seat while being turned. After all that work, let's have a look at the time graph and see the fruits of our labor. After regulating the movement, I'm pretty happy with those results. Our amplitude is up significantly, our rate is perfect, and the beat area is as good as it's going to get. Let's get that Waterworks rotor back onto the movement. In order to make sure it's balanced correctly, we have to turn the first reduction wheel so that its mark points to the balance breech stud. The rotor is then fitted at a 90-degree angle to that, over the winding stem. We add a little HP 1300 oil to each of the ball bearings and we're done. We're getting closer to getting this watch done, finally. Let's fit that dial, then we can move on to getting the hands fitted. Before we can do that though, we need to set the watch to the midnight position by turning the winding stem so the date dial just flips over. We place the hour hand first, taking care to line it up with the 12 o'clock position and then press it down, followed by the minute hand, and finally the seconds hand. Once that's done, we can wind the watch a few times to make sure the hands don't touch either the dial or each other. Finally, we can case the movement. I find it easiest to lay the movement face up and then to place the case over it, making sure to align the 12 o'clock position with the indices on the chapter ring. I've replaced the O-rings on the winding stem, so I'm applying a little silicone grease to these before installing the stem a final time. I've also replaced the case back seal and fitted that off camera. And there we go, one fully serviced and repaired Seiko SKX Pepsi. Thank you so very much for joining me, and I hope to see you soon with the next project. Take care.